Life is divided up into the horrible and the miserable.
So our next speaker is as close as it gets to someone who needs no introduction. He's one of the busiest, most in-demand people you'll ever meet. He's internationally known for his remarkable insights and work to do with unity of the mind and body and health and healing. And so I'm just going to directly turn the mic over to Dr. Gabor Mate. Please give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Stephen, and to Andrew as well for, again, inviting me to this wonderful conference. And considering what I might say today, I thought, well, what is it that we're all looking for? I mean, what are we all doing here? And why are we all seeking these experiences? In the last year and a half, I've had experiences with ayahuasca, which is the main teacher that I work with psilocybin, with LSD, with 5-MeO-DMT, and with holotropic breathwork. And I was thinking, well, what am I actually looking for? Somebody who we worked with ayahuasca, a woman whose name is Andrea, sent us an email. When I say us, I'm not using the royal we, I'm saying us, a group of us, that she worked with, an email about her teaching with ayahuasca. I'll just read you a little bit about what she said. After purging, the flow continued, but with a sense of evolution or transformation. And as I went through it, it transformed into a dragon. This holds a very strong meaning to me. When I found this form, I found self-love. I was filled with so much joy and love. For the first time in my life, I felt amazing unconditional love for myself. Even just typing this letter, I tear up. It took 34 years to finally love myself. And I'd say that's pretty good. If she did it in 34 years, she's way ahead of the game. I asked how to hold on to this, how to keep my dragon, and this amazing love that I've discovered, and was made clear. Honor thyself, make decisions that strengthen you, not weaken you. Release ego. If you live to prove something, to please others, you will kill your dragon. And a few other points that she learned, but it's that phrase about if you live to prove something, to please others, you will kill your dragon. I suggest that all of us, that the dragon is her phrase. That may not be an entity or an image that personally resonates with you, but whether it does or not, what she's talking about, Andrea is talking about, is finding herself and connecting with her essence. And I'm suggesting to you that all of us, doesn't matter what we believe, impels us to do this work with the plant spirits. What we're actually looking for essentially is ourselves. And if we're looking essentially for ourselves, the question is, why do we have to look? What happened? And how does this experience with the plants, substances, help us find ourselves? Now, as some of you know, my work, amongst others, has been with addictions. And in addiction, there's a very interesting phrase that's used. When you heal from addiction, it's called recovery. And recovery is another interesting word because we just take it for granted, but think about it for a moment. What does recovery mean? It means that you find something that you've lost. You find something that you've lost, but whatever you found couldn't have been destroyed, and it must have been there all along, otherwise you couldn't find it. So what is it that people recover when they recover from, say, addiction? Well, what they recover, and I often ask this question, and the spontaneous response, including at a talk I gave yesterday, is, I found myself. So people recover themselves, which is exactly what Andrea is writing about. She found her dragon, she found herself. And then the question then is, how do we lose ourselves? And why is it so difficult to reconnect? And how do these experiences with the plants help us? How do they facilitate this reconnection. And that question leads to the very essence of trauma. Because what I'm suggesting is that it's trauma that makes us disconnect in the first place. In fact, it's not that trauma that makes us disconnect. Trauma is the disconnection. And my friend Peter Levine, who is one of the world trauma experts, written a wonderful book, amongst many other wonderful books, called Waking the Tiger. And he defines trauma as the loss of connection with yourself. He says a fundamental fracture, a loss of connection to ourselves, our families, and the world around us. This loss is often hard to recognize because it happens slowly over time. We adapt to these subtle changes, sometimes without even noticing them. And so, trauma is not the external event that happens. Trauma is the impact of that event, which is the disconnection from ourselves. And because it can be subtle and happen over time, we actually adapt in such ways that we believe we're the adaptations. We start to think that we are the adaptations that we've come to as a result of the trauma of disconnection. So we start to believe that we are the disconnection, and we are the forms and manifestations that disconnection assumes. Now, this definition that Peter gives is also the one given by other great spiritual teachers. Eckhart Tolle says, basically all emotions are modifications of one primordial, undifferentiated emotion that has its origin in the loss of awareness of who you are beyond the name and the form. And that's associated with a sense of abandonment, with a sense of incompleteness. And he says the simplest word for it is pain. But pain, of course, is so non-specific. It's that loss of self. And my other great mentor, A.H. Almaas, writes, the fundamental thing that happened, and the greatest calamity, is not that there was no love or support. He's talking about in childhood. Let me pause here for a moment and tell you that as a physician, I found that it doesn't matter what the ailment is. The essence of it is the loss of connection to the self. So whether you've got multiple sclerosis, whether you've got rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue, colitis, Crohn's disease, chronic asthma, cancer, ALS, it actually begins with a disconnection from the self. I won't not have the time to prove that to you today. That's a whole other talk. I'm just telling you my conclusion about that. I've written about it. If you move to do so, you can read about it. But the essence of all this dis-ease or disease is that disconnection from the self and the result of the adaptations. It's not that the disconnection makes us sick, it's our adaptations to that disconnection that make us sick. So what begins as an adaptation, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment, ends up causing illness. And whether that's physical illness or mental illness, it doesn't matter. It all comes to the same thing. And the same with addiction. So addiction is just another adaptation. Addiction, some of you know I worked in the downtown east side of Vancouver. North America is the most concentrated area of drug use. And every person down there had been abused as a child. And all the women I worked with had been sexually abused. All the men had been traumatized sexually or in other ways. The addiction is not the problem. The reason that we don't treat addiction very well, which is to say that we don't treat it very well is an understatement, is precisely because we don't get that the addiction is not the problem. The addiction is an adaptation. And let me just give you my definition of addiction. Any behavior that gives you temporary relief, pleasure, that you crave, and that you pursue despite negative consequences. So that's an addiction. Any behavior. Drugs, sex, gambling, internet, relationships, work, whatever it is, eating. It's any behavior that provides temporary relief and pleasure, and you crave despite the negative consequences. So that's an addiction. So let me ask you, by that definition, how many of you would agree that at some time or another you've had some kind of addictive pattern in your life? Just raise your hands, would you? Okay, all right. So let me ask some of you that are willing to say so. And I'm not going to ask you what you're addicted to or when or for how long, but simply, what did it do for you? Not what was wrong with it, but what did you like about it? Okay, so anybody? Yes? Gave you? It gave you pleasure. Okay, great. Thank you. Who else? Yes.
Avoidance of the other.
I'm sorry?
An avoidance of the other.
Avoidance.
The pressure, the stress, the conflict.
Okay, avoidance of conflict. Thank you. Yes.
Ease the pain.
It eases the pain. Yes. Distraction from the pain. Okay, great. So thank you. I mean, we could go on, but can you see that everything you said, easing of pain, avoidance of conflict, pleasure, these are normal human aspirations. There's nothing wrong with any of them. In other words, the addiction wasn't your problem. Your problem is, how come on God's green earth you could find no pleasure? Something had blocked your capacity to experience pleasure and joy. Something had created so much conflict in your life that you had to escape from it. Something had given you so much pain that you needed distraction or relief from the pain. And hence my mantra, the first question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And that pain goes back to that original disconnection. And so my other teacher, A.H. Alma, says, speaking about childhood, the fundamental thing that happened and the greatest calamity is not that there was no love or support. The greater calamity, which is caused by that first calamity, is that you lost the connection to your essence. That is much more important than whether your mother or father loved you or not. And by extension, I'm going to make the perhaps astonishing statement that the fundamental problem was not that you were sexually abused, was not that you were beaten, was not that you were abandoned, not that your parents couldn't love you the way you needed to be loved. It's that as a result of all that, you lost the connection to yourself. That's the trauma. So there's the external event, then the impact. And although it's impossible to have it happen this way, but had you been beaten and abused, but had that not resulted in the disconnect from yourself, you would not have been traumatized. And so that what are we looking for then is that reconnection with ourselves. And the loss of connection itself is an adaptation. Why is that an adaptation? Because if it's so painful to be myself, I better disconnect. If it's so painful for me to be aware of my gut feelings and to be able to assert them and to manifest them and to declare them, I better disconnect from my gut feelings. And it's that connection from the gut feeling, which happens right in the body. That's the trauma. And then we spend the rest of our lives trying to compensate. How do we compensate? Well, through addiction. Or we compensate by developing certain personality patterns that then will somehow try to get us indirectly what we didn't get in the first place, which is the love that would have allowed us to connect to ourselves. So then we become our personalities. At least we become who we think we are as a personality. So if you didn't get the attention that you needed as a child, just for yourself, then you might become consumed by attracting attention, then you'll be attractive all the time. And hence the $30 billion cosmetic surgery industry, because people have lost the connection to themselves, and now they want validation from the outside. Or you didn't get the approval you needed for who you were, now you want to win approval from others as a substitute. You weren't valued for who you were, now you're consumed by measuring up to others' expectations so that you can get your sense of value through what others think of you, what other people think of you. You weren't esteemed for who you are, now you're going to be wanting to impress people all the time. And then these are all adaptations. These are all adaptations. But we mistake ourselves for adaptations. And then because we couldn't be ourselves, because being ourselves would have meant too much pain, too much suffering, too much vulnerability, vulnerability, the Latin word vulnerare, to wound, our wound would be too raw. We cover up our vulnerability by these compensatory mechanisms, and we close our hearts. And when we close our hearts, we no longer know how to love ourselves or others. And we no longer have pleasure or joy. And then you have the statement by Meister Eckhart, who's the 13th century spiritual master, who says, a human being has so many skins inside, covering the depths of the heart. We know so many things, but we don't know ourselves. Again, that loss of self. Why? 30 or 40 skins or hides, as thick and as hard as an ox's or a bear's, cover the soul. And he says, go into your ground and learn to know yourself there. Well, why to develop these skins, these hides? These are the compensations. These are how we try and protect ourselves from that woundedness. And that same adaptation that helped us endure those early losses, and primarily the loss of ourselves, then become our burden, then become our separation from the world. That's the source of our alienation. And the problem is, this doesn't only happen on an individual level, it happens in a social level. Because we live in a society that actually is profoundly alienated. And we live in a society that actually validates our invalidity. We live in a society that validates our false self. So that not only do we develop these compensatory mechanisms, it's even that we're rewarded for it. So let's say you're a deeply wounded person and you emotionally shut down so badly that your eyes go dead because you were hurt so badly. You couldn't bear to look at reality. And let's say that you're so scared of vulnerability that you're going to attack vulnerability wherever you see it. And let's say that you feel so weak because you lost that connection to your true self, that you have to have power and control. You know what becomes of you? You become Prime Minister of Canada. That's a deeply traumatized person that we just displaced. He is. He is. And now we've elected another one. Maybe not quite so traumatized. Maybe not quite so wounded. Maybe a little bit more connected. Maybe a little bit. That's the best we can hope for. What I'm saying is that the world rewards, or in my case, the world rewards my workaholism, because look, this wonderful doctor, always available for everybody except himself, and everybody except the people that really need him close to him. So the world rewards it, and so, as the author of the book, the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying says, the greatest achievement of modern culture is the brilliant selling of samsara. Samsara is the cycle of suffering, and its barren distractions. Modern society seems to me a celebration of all the things that lead away from truth, make truth hard to live for, and discourage people even from believing that it exists. So not only do we suffer this trauma because our parents were unconscious or so hurt themselves that they simply couldn't help traumatizing us, we then have a world that validates the falseness, that validates the personality, which was developed as a compensation for the loss. And that's why it's so difficult. And that's why even when people go into ceremony with a plant or with LSD, which is not a plant, but a substance, or holotropic breathwork, or meditation, and whatever experiences they have, and there are experiences of tremendous insight that people can journey through these various modalities. The real difficulty is not in having those experiences. The real difficulty is then how do you make that experience live in your life? How do you manifest that insight in your daily living, when the world is so intent of unrobbing you of the very truth of things, because the economy, the capitalist economy, depends on your false sense of self. If you were truly too connected to yourself, you wouldn't buy most of the products that you buy. At least you wouldn't be so attached to them. You know, I was in San Francisco 3 or 4 years ago, and my wife and I were walking somewhere in the downtown area, and we found this line of people, 4 or 5 abreast, right around the block. So I said to somebody, okay, what's this all about? What are you people lining up for? He says, the iPad, the new iPad just came out. And I said, okay, I get it. I don't have an iPad. I don't appreciate its multifold benefits, but nevertheless, I said, okay, I can believe that the iPad is a wonderful instrument, but why are you lining up? I couldn't get it tomorrow. Or Man, you don't understand. It's the iPad. I mean, this guy actually thought, and I've had the same thoughts in relation to other products, that this is going to somehow make a difference in his life. So, I mean, this society just feeds off that. So then, let me tell you a few things that I've learned in this psychedelic experience. And I began to work with ayahuasca about 8 years ago now, I guess, when my book on addiction came out. And I kept getting these emails or of questions at my speaking engagements. What do I know about ayahuasca and the healing of addiction? And I'd say, well, I don't know anything about it really. And next question. And a week later, another email or another inquiry. What do you know about ayahuasca and the healing of addiction? I said, nothing. Next question. And I finally started getting annoyed. And I've said this before, but I started feeling like Brian in The Life of Brian. Have you seen that movie? Where people think that Brian is the Messiah, and they keep genuflecting, and they keep, wanting to worship him. And he's saying, listen, I'm not the Messiah, leave me alone. But finally he gets sick of it, and he says, okay, I'm the Messiah, now fuck off, okay? And these people come to him and say, how shall we fuck off, my Lord? And that's how I was with ayahuasca. Okay, I don't know anything about ayahuasca, now fuck off. And then I got the message that maybe the universe is trying to tell me something. I do have a thick brain, a very thick mind. And I was working with psilocybin this summer with a therapist in San Francisco, and I did say to her, listen, you better give me a whole whack of it, because I have a very thick mind, But I got it. There was a message here, and so then I began to work with it, and I really see how it can help. How can it help? And not just ayahuasca, but any path, any substance, and sometimes other paths that don't involve substances. I mean, one of the things I don't want to create here is the impression that I'm not one of these messianic believers in substances or plants. I really am not. Some of you maybe, I'm not. I don't think they're the answers to the problems of the world. I think it's too bad if they were, because they're never going to be around enough of them, and not enough people will participate in them, that they're going to be the answer. The answer is going to have to come from somewhere else. And where the answer is going to have to come from? Deep inside people, because the truth is already there. So the plants don't give us the truth. The plant helps us manifest and see the truth. That's a great path, but I'm not messianic about it. But nevertheless, since we're talking about plants and the plant spirit, how can they help us? So in 2 ways really. Well, at least 2 ways. The first one, when I first did ayahuasca, because somebody said, you know what, you can actually do a ceremony up here in Vancouver, and a Peruvian shaman that I know Andrew works with, Diego Palma, was up here, and he was leading ceremonies, and about an hour into it, this beautiful music was playing, and there were tears of joy and pleasure coursing down my face, and I felt this tremendous love, and it wasn't love. There was love for particular people, but it was much greater than that. And what I really got was that this love is actually my essence. Which is not to say, and the essence that I've been disconnected from all my life, these skins that I've developed over my heart to protect myself from the pain, because when your heart is open and the love is flowing, you really can get hurt. And last year in December in Yalapa, where I lead the retreats with ayahuasca, I had the experience of my heart opening up and trust connecting me with the universe, and I got that really that's our essence, that opening, that open-heartedness, that love is our essence. And if that's our essence, why don't we realize it? Why doesn't Stephen Harper realize it? Why don't the rest of us realize it? It's because it hurts so much when it's not reciprocated. It hurts so much when it's not understood. It hurts so much when it's wounded. And so we develop these skins, we shut down. And specifically about addictions like many other behaviors are all about escaping from the pain. But if we realize that that love is really our very essence, there's nothing to run away from. What's there to run if you really get it? And the other thing that the plant spirits can do is they can connect us to the experiences in a very deep way that made us run in the first place. And so sometimes people talk about bad experiences with ayahuasca or acid or anything. From my point of view, when somebody talks about a bad experience, two things are going on. One is their personality, their mind is judging the experience, because the personality was developed in the first place to run away from the pain. And all these things that we think we are, they're just our personality, which was developed in the first place as a compensation not to feel pain. But secondly, it also means that when they had that experience, they didn't have the right guidance. Because in the appropriate context, and this is where I think I will probably not be the only one at this conference to emphasize this, but whatever you do, and I know some of you have journeyed by yourselves, I don't recommend it. If you choose that, you choose that. But really, I think we're such complicated, complex beings in the Western world, and there's so much cultural and psychological barrier between who we think we are and who we actually are, that it's really safer to engage in these journeys with people that are experienced and somewhat wise in helping us guide us through it. So when somebody talks about a bad experience, I say, no, you didn't have a bad experience. What you had is an experience where you experienced pain. What you had was an experience where you were in touch with a lot of fear, maybe even terror. But that pain and that terror, you've been carrying inside yourself all your life. And you've been running away from it all your life. It's not a bad thing to experience them. It's only bad if you have no means to digest the experience, to understand it, to put it into context, and to move on for it. So when I work with people with ayahuasca, or when I go into an experience myself with some other guide, whether with 5-MeO, DMT, or whether with psilocybin, or whatever it is, I don't care whether pain is going to come up, fear is going to come up, terror is going to come up. In fact, if it comes up, so be it, because it's only coming up because it's already there. Would I rather be aware of it and know it and revisit it with the awareness and the strength and the mind of an adult? Or would I keep myself still in denial of it? So there are no bad experiences. There are only experiences whose meaning you haven't divined, you haven't had the guidance to understand, and you haven't had the support to integrate into your life. So for me, it's never about beautiful experiences, entities, songs, beautiful colors. That happens, that's great. That's what you're meant to have at that time. I'm not putting that down, but that can't be the intention. The intention has to be the truth, whatever the truth is. And if the truth at that moment is painful, that's great. That's great. Because once we realize, our essence, well, first of all, once we realize the degree of pain that we each carry, the fear that we each carry. Let me give you a quote from Almas. He says, the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother suffers, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. The organism does not develop the confidence that it can regulate itself and that things will happen as they should. And if the pain and suffering continues, they will have a disintegrating effect on the organism, and the child will experience organismic fear for its very survival. So when people at our ceremonies experience terror, I say congratulations, you've gone back to your experience as an infant. This is a memory. This is not who you are. And underneath that fear, there's that connected self that knows no fear. What's there to be afraid of when you're connected to everything? So those are the two major dynamics that I find helpful in the plant-spirit experiences. First of all, we get to find what we're running from, the fear, the pain. And if we're fortunate enough, then before or after, we also get to experience the depth of who we are, which also means we don't have to keep running. And then the issue becomes then, how do you incorporate that? How do you integrate that into your life? And so I have to emphasize here the importance of integration. So don't expect the insight, which is like a door opening, to save you, because it won't. Because you can have that experience in the moment under the influence of the particular substance that you've been working with. But unless you are intent on taking that substance all the time, which you can't, then you better find ways of integrating that insight into your life. And that takes daily work. That takes daily work. So the post-ceremony, or the post-event, the post-experience integration is at least as important as the experience itself. Otherwise, you're just going to keep going back, looking for the same experience over and over again. And nothing necessarily will have shifted for you. There are some people, with or without substances, who are able to have a transformative, transcendental experience that really does rewire them permanently. But I've met very few of those people. I've met very few of them, if any. I know of some. But for most of us, it's ongoing work. So the experiences can open those doors of perception. They can give us glimpses or deep but momentary experiences of our true selves. But then the work is to go back and keep clearing out all the accumulated debris that we've took on ever since early infancy to compensate for the loss. So when you understand my definition of trauma, which has to do with that disconnect, then you understand that trauma has many different manifestations. There's a psychological, emotional aspect of trauma, which is that disconnect from the self, and therefore also a relationship to the world. So a traumatized person, and by my definition, most of us are traumatized. We live in a different world. We live in a world where we're alone. We live in a world which is perhaps dangerous. We live in a world that's indifferent. We live in a world where we have to constantly having to work to validate ourselves. That's the world we live in. And the Buddha said very clearly that it's with our thoughts, with our minds that we create the world. That's the world that we create. The problem is, this is the task of modern psychology perhaps, this is where modern psychology can so usefully blend with ancient spiritual teaching, is that before our minds create the world creates our minds. And so we have to go back to who we were before the world created our mind. In terms of mental health, depression, anxiety, addiction, psychoses, these all begin as compensations. You might think, how can depression be a compensation? Well, let me give you an example. Let's say you have a 2-year-old and she's angry with you. Incidentally, if you do have a 2-year-old and she's not angry with you, you haven't done your job. It's that simple. Because she cannot have a cookie before dinner. And she can't have a shiny knife to play with. And she can't pull the dog's tail. And she can't climb on the windowsill when the window is open. You have to say no. And 2-year-olds, like many of us as adults even, can't distinguish between their needs and their wants. So when you frustrate somebody's perceived needs, they get aggressive. Frustration is the engine of aggression, as my friend, the psychologist Gordon Neufeld says. So the child gets aggressively angry because she couldn't have that cookie. Nothing wrong with that, so long as you're not threatened by the anger. But what if you grew up in a family where there was rage a lot, where your parents were in conflict, rageful conflict, and you have this intrinsic and innate, implicit memory of fear whenever you experience or witness anger, and then unwittingly you give the message to your 2-year-old that good little girls don't get angry. What the child is getting is not that good little girls don't get angry, but that angry little girls don't get loved. And what will she do with the anger? Since she can't do without your love, she cannot. She's going to push the anger down. What's the word for pushing something down? Depression. And 30 years later, she'll be diagnosed with depression. And somebody will hand her a pill. And that pill, which I'm not against, I've taken them, they can be helpful, but they're not the answer. The answer is to actually, what is it that I've pushed down? And why did I? And do I still need to? In other words, to reconnect again with the real self. So that mental health issues, they all begin with compensations. The tuning out of ADHD is not a disease. It's a coping mechanism to deal with overwhelming stress. These temporary compensatory mechanisms become a source of pathology later on. Physical health, when you suppress yourself in order to please others, because of the mind and the body being one unit, they're inseparable. This is not my particular insight. This is what science shows us. And as I was saying to a medical colleague just a few minutes ago, that the problem with medicine is we keep talking about evidence-based practice, but we ignore much of the evidence. And the evidence is that when you suppress emotions, you're actually suppressing the immune system as well, for the simple reason that you can't separate the mind from the body. Scientifically, you can't. And the consequence is then the immune system will attack you, and now you have autoimmune disease like multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis, or you get cancer. That too began as a compensation. That pushing down of emotion was how you compensated for your parents' inability to handle your emotions. Trauma has then impacts on physical health, on your relationships, and finally, of course, it's got a spiritual aspect because, and spirituality is such a loaded word in the sense that we all load it with our own particular meanings, but I'll give you my own general understanding of it, which is spirituality is the awareness that we're not our personalities, that we're not just our bodies, we're not just our thoughts and our emotions. There's something deeper, more eternal, more connected about us, and that connection is with the universe. Well, when you're traumatized, you shut that down too. So this is where the plant medicines can be so helpful. And I've known people that are healing from significant autoimmune diseases that they were given up for dead by medical doctors. People that are healing or have healed from multiple sclerosis, from suicidal depression. Last year we worked with a woman in our retreat that had tried to kill herself 17 times. Where is the healing coming from? Well, the very meaning of the word healing means wholeness. And we become whole when we reconnect with ourselves. I'll leave you the final quote before I take questions and comments. Thomas Merton, the spiritual teacher, Catholic monk, talked about surrendering, conquering ourselves, or allowing the spirit to conquer us. So self-conquest is not a willful act of self-abnegation. What it actually is surrendering to something greater than we are. And as a Catholic, he'd call that the Holy Spirit, but you can call it whatever you want. And he says, in order to gain possession ourselves, we have to have some confidence, some hope of victory. In order to keep that hope alive, we must usually have some taste of victory. We must know what victory is and like it better than defeat. Now, at the very least, this work with the plant spirits can give us a taste of that victory, can give us a glimpse of ourselves, can give us a glimpse of reality. And that can be the beginning of the path to healing. Thank you. Thank you.
So as we haven't had any sessions with questions and answers yet, haven't said anything about that, our normal hope and expectation is that it be a question and not a statement, because that can sometimes go on too long. In this case, it's up to Gabor, because we actually have a little over 15 minutes, so I'll let him guide that. But the other thing I want you to do is come to these microphones, because everything's being recorded, and just line up on either side if you want to ask a question. Thank you.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Rocky. I'd like to know how could me, go about getting a treatment, as it were, for...
Treatment.
Yes, psilocybin. Where does one go for a safe place to do that?
Okay. There are people here. I think everybody sees you. There are people here that work with all kinds of modalities, including ayahuasca, including psilocybin. So those of you that work with such substances and are willing to help this friend, please meet him afterwards. You're welcome. Okay, should we go back? Okay, whoever's next, go ahead.
Let's take turns either side.
Okay.
Yeah, since I have myself a 3-year-old, a beautiful little daughter,
Yeah.
a question connected to that kind of topic you scratched.
Yeah.
What's your suggestion? What can I do better than what has been done to generations of little people before us?
Well, let's make it more personal. In a sense of trauma that I described, do you recognize yourself?
Yes, I'm recognizing myself as the parent that gets angry and annoyed.
Okay, all right, so that's what you can do. Because your anger and your annoyance, your child will interpret only in one way.
Yeah, I realize where it comes from.
Which is that there's something wrong with her. The child will not recognize you as being angry and annoyed. She'll recognize herself as being deficient and flawed.
Yeah.
Because children are narcissists. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean in the actual technical sense. They think it's all about them. So the best thing you can do for her is to do your own healing work. It's just in really taking it on. Now, You already are, otherwise you wouldn't be here asking the question.
Yeah.
So your daughter's already way ahead of where you were at the same age, because your parents probably were not asking them themselves these questions, were they?
Probably not. And I actually have to thank you to remind me to continue my personal journey.
That's what you can do for your child. I will also recommend that you read one of the books I wrote on, which is on parenting. It's called Hold On to Your Kids. That'll tremendously help you with your parenting, but that's less important than the work you're doing on yourself.
I didn't understand your answer.
Okay, I've written a book called Hold On to Your Kids.
Oh.
It's for parents. Okay, I wrote it with a friend of mine who I quoted, Gordon Neufeld, the psychologist.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very important parenting book. I'll promise you that 100%. But I'm also saying, reading that book, it's important, but it's not as important as the work that you're going to keep doing on yourself. Okay?
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. A few weeks ago, I attended the conference.
I'm not sure, is the mic on? Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much for your talk.
Okay.
A few weeks ago, I attended the psychedelic psychotherapy conference in Victoria. You gave a wonderful talk there. You cited the work of the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott.
Yeah.
I was really impressed with it. Today, you spoke about compensation for early childhood injuries as part of trauma, and it sounded to me very close to the work of Alfred Adler. And I wonder if that is also someone you use in your work.
That's interesting because you may not know this, but I'm actually in a play at the Vancouver Cultural Center, and tonight is the last performance. I portray myself. It's not a big stretch, but the play, which is about childhood trauma, somebody asked the same question about Adler, and my answer is simply that any work that I do, any work that anybody does, is always built on foundations that other people have laid. So Adler's awareness of family systems and all that certainly has informed my work. But it's not that I follow any one particular discipline. I just take what I can from wherever I can find it and just shape it into my own particular formulation of it. But yeah, Adler is certainly there in the mix. Thank you. Devin, hi.
Hi, Gabor. I was just wondering if you could speak with us a little bit about when shame comes up and the origins of shame as you relate it to repressed emotion and how we might work skillfully with shame, especially with these types of plant spirit medicines.
Okay. It's a great question, thank you. So I'll tell you about a psilocybin experience I had this summer, and you heard it last night at the play because you were there. So, but I'll tell it to this group. So I'm I'm in San Francisco on a speaking trip, and I have a day off, and so I'm using the day to have a psilocybin experience with a therapist whose name is Francois. I'm at a friend's house, and this is where I said to the guide, "You better give me a big whack, because I have a very thick mind," So she does. And 2 hours later, I'm lying there on the mat, curled up like a baby, sobbing. And I'm looking at Francois, realizing that her name is Francois, that she's a therapist. I'm having a mushroom experience. My name is Gabor. I'm 71 years old, and so on and so forth. I'm fully aware of present reality, but at the same time, I'm in the configuration of a baby who's crying and all curled up. Tears are coming down my face, and I'm looking at Francois, and I know she's not my mother, but she is my mother. So I'm there simultaneously. I'm there as adult and infant. And the difference between Francois and my birth mother is that this mother, Francois, can actually receive and hear my deepest grief, which is my mother couldn't. And that's why I disconnected. And I say to her, Francois, mother, I say to her, I'm so sorry for having made your life so difficult. So that's me, as a 6-month-old, as a 1-year-old Jewish infant under Nazi occupation with a mother whose parents died in Auschwitz and whose husband is away in a forced labor camp. And her terror and her unhappiness, I take on as my fault. I am so sorry for having made your life so difficult. That's the original guilt. That's the original sin, if you like, that we all suffer from, that we couldn't make our parents happy. It's got nothing to do with anything we did. And so that original shame goes back that early, before we had any concept of right or wrong. And shame, when you think of what shame is, what does shame look like? Here's what it looks like. The neck falls down, the neck is bent, the eyes are averted, and the body slumps. That's a physiological state. So shame is a physiological state which represents an overactivation. As a physician, you know this. It represents an overactivation of a part of our nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, as opposed to the sympathetic part, or the willful parts. The parasympathetic has to do with slackness and vegetation and rest. And so when this is overactive, this is what we look like. You can put a 9-month-old baby into a shame state. Long before the baby has any concept of having done anything wrong, there's no formulation for it, you can put a baby into a shame state, this state, simply by having the mother look into the baby's eyes, and they're then locked in this attuned, happy, joyful mother-infant interaction, and the mother averts her eyes, the baby goes into a shame state. Which is to say that shame is all about disconnection from love. Before you did anything wrong. Now, when you reconnect with the love, as I talked about, guess what? You're overcoming the shame. So the answer to shame is love. Not a whole lot of reassurances, don't worry about it, you did nothing wrong. No, the answer to shame is love. In the absence of love, we experience shame. And for me, that psilocybin experience was really instructive because I knew it intellectually already, but this time I actually experienced it.
It feels like also when we have those adaptations and those protectors that come up, the shame is sort of like it's guarding us against feeling that shame, and when shame is surfacing, it's a good thing, really.
It's a good thing as long as we can experience it with awareness.
Yeah, and
rather than we identify with it. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Devin. And Devin is talking here tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi there. Thank you. I was wondering if you could speak a little more to post ceremony integration.
Yeah.
You mentioned that it was at least as important or a significant part of the process of healing. So I was wondering if you could share, based on your observations, on your reflections, what are some of the challenges people have with that, and what are some of the ways you found to deepen and continue some of those insights and put them into daily living?
Sure, thank you. So, one, just to speak personally, I've told this story before, but I'm coming back from a retreat. This is about 5 years ago. I'm coming back from a retreat with ayahuasca that I facilitated, that I helped to lead. Again, I'm not an ayahuasquero. I don't chant. I don't lead ceremonies, but I lead the retreat. And the whole idea of the retreat, by the way, is that just coming together for one night with a bunch of strangers or relative strangers, drinking or partaking in the ceremony, and then dispersing in the morning was never the idea. Culturally, all these practices developed in a setting, in a context of community and guidance. So we thought, well, how do we at least partially recreate that? So hence the idea of a retreat where people are together for a week and there's a number of ceremonies together and they process and integrate as a group what happened with each of them. But that's just a week. So, but anyway, I'm coming back to answer your question about how disconnected we become so quickly. I'm coming back from a retreat in Nelson, which is where I was working at the time, with ceremony. And I'm just absolutely enthralled with myself, just how great and insightful I was, and all these connections that I help people make, and just, I must have really got it, I finally got it. And my wife picks me up at the 25th and King Edward at the SkyTrain station, and she just had a new haircut, which I don't like. And life all of a sudden becomes not worth living, So this is how evanescent it can be, So I'm no shining example of integration, but at least I wasn't. So, first of all, as much as possible, have the experience in the first place in some kind of a context where you're connected with people that you can stay connected to afterwards, if that's possible. Create that context if you can, or join a context where that happens, number one. Number two, stay in touch with the people. We're finding now that, and Devin, who just spoke, and she's been in retreat with us, and she'll help to lead the next one. She participated. I didn't have the time, but Devin and another colleague did. They had a Skype group that met regularly to talk about their experiences. So keep it going, keep the conversation going. Number two. Number three, whatever you experienced in ceremony, hang out with it afterwards. Do take 5 minutes a day. And it sounds so easy, but it's so difficult for people to even find the 5 minutes. But take 5 minutes a day and take yourself back to whatever you experienced, and just be with it emotionally and physically, and hang out with it so that it stays fresh in your mind. And then have some practice that connects you with yourself, be it yoga, be it meditation, be it chanting, be it music, be it dance, be it whatever it is. But have some practice of reconnection. Mindful awareness. Practice mindful awareness as much as you can. So the long and the short of it is, and actually there's a real concern in the ayahuasca world at least, that people do have these experiences, but then there's no follow-up. So there's some international initiatives now to actually set up online programs and online structures where people that have had isolated experiences can connect with others and get some guidance. That hasn't materialized yet, but I'm aware of them, and I'm to some extent involved with them. So that will also happen. So all those ways.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry, Gabor, but we got to stop there. Thank you very much.
All right.
There's an old
Please
joke.
give him another thank you hand.
Thank you.
And then he says, "Boy, the food at this place is really terrible." The other one says, "Yeah, I know, and such small portions." Well, that's essentially how I feel about life. Full of loneliness and misery and suffering and unhappiness, and it's all over much too quickly.